been kind of putting on a show. But I'm tired of performing. And I can tell you right now that it is exhausting.
Remember when all those content creators were getting subpoenaed by Blake Lively? You know, the ones. Then Google was subpoenaed too, asked to hand over account information for 16 creators. One of those subpoenas may have even had my name on it, though it landed in my spam folder and was promptly deleted. But now Blake has clearly narrowed her focus, and one person in particular is fighting back. This is Hot Mics with Billy Bush, presented by our friends at LA Golf. Welcome to the show. We're on TuneIn, YouTube, and everywhere you get your content. Blake Lively has been issuing subpoenas aggressively, convinced that content creators have been paid or pressured to portray her negatively, allegedly at the direction of Justin Baldoni and his legal team. One creator now squarely in her sights is Andy Signore of Popcorn Planet, who joins us shortly. But first, let's lay out the background. In December 2024, Blake Lively filed a federal lawsuit in New York against Justin Baldoni, Wayfarer Studios, and others. She alleges harassment, retaliation related to It Ends With Us, breach of contract, and additional claims. Central to her case is the assertion that once she spoke out, a coordinated retaliation and smear campaign was launched against her. According to her complaint, Baldoni and their associates used third-party advocates and online content creators to seed negative narratives across social media, Reddit, and smaller outlets with minimal editorial oversight, which were then amplified by larger publications to damage her reputation. Baldoni's team has firmly denied these accusations. What Blake is seeking from Andy Signore is particularly notable. On July 2, 2025, her attorneys issued multiple subpoenas connected to the Baldoni case, including subpoenas directed at Andy Signore, Popcorn Planet, and Google for account-related data. The key subpoena demands that Andy turn over all communications with Justin Baldoni, Wayfarer, or their representatives regarding Blake Lively, the film It Ends With Us, and any agreements, deals, or compensation related to coverage of the dispute. The goal is to uncover evidence of coordination, what was said, how narratives were framed, and whether there was collusion with publicists such as Melissa Nathan or Jen Al. Blake's legal team argues. These materials are central to proving her defamation and smear campaign theory. Initially, Blake also subpoenaed Google for payment and account data tied to multiple creators, including Andy, but later withdrew parts of that subpoena after significant backlash, particularly concerning journalists. There's a limit to how broadly you can target the internet. Andy's response was to fight back. Based in Florida, Popcorn Planet filed a separate case seeking to quash the subpoena. Andy argues that he is engaged in journalism as an investigative reporter running a news and commentary platform. He claims the requested materials are protected under Florida's journalist's privilege statute as well as the federal First Amendment reporter's privilege, and that the subpoena places an undue burden on him when the information should instead be obtained directly from Baldoni and Wayfarer. Publicly, Andy has described this as a chilling attack on independent journalism that threatens content creators and whistleblowers who rely on source protection. However, on December 2, 2025, a federal magistrate judge in Tampa, Lindsey Griffin, denied Popcorn Planet's amended motion to quash and ruled in Blake Lively's favor. In her ruling, Judge Griffin characterized Popcorn Planet as little more than a YouTube channel operated by a for-profit Florida media corporation. Andy Signore is the founder, CEO, host, editor, and producer, a one-man operation rather than a traditional newsroom. The court concluded that he failed to demonstrate that Popcorn Planet fits within Florida's statutory definition of a journalist, which includes newspapers, news agencies, television or radio stations, and similar entities covering news on YouTube. The judge held does not automatically qualify someone for journalist protections under state law. The court further found that Blake met the high legal threshold required to overcome any qualified privilege, because the requested communications are directly relevant to her claims that Baldoni and Wayfarer orchestrated a defamation campaign using third-party creators. The judge also accepted Blake's argument that she had attempted to obtain the same information from Baldoni and Wayfarer and failed, creating a compelling need for the subpoenaed materials. This stands in contrast to rulings in the main New York case, where Judge Louis Lemon restricted Blake's efforts to obtain broad internal communications from Baldoni's team, requiring specific and non-speculative justification. In this situation, however, Andy Signore is a third party, not a defendant, and the court held that different discovery rules apply. As a result, Blake can seek Andy's communications with Baldoni, even if she cannot freely access Baldoni's internal emails. The ruling has sparked concern among press freedom advocates, particularly over the implication that internet-based journalism may not qualify for traditional protections. Many point out that modern journalism has evolved, citing figures like Barry Weiss, who built the free press online before expanding it into a major media operation. With that context, we now welcome Andy Signore, joining us from Tampa, Florida. Andy, thanks for being here. How are you holding up after last week's decision? Andy responded that the ruling was deeply frustrating, particularly the way it was written, and pushed back against claims that his legal team missed deadlines or mishandled the process. That's simply false. We gave her everything. What's most jarring and honestly chilling is that the court ignored the federal First Amendment reporter's privilege, which should take precedence over any Florida statute. This was a federal court, meaning the First Amendment protections apply regardless of whether you're in Florida, Nevada, or New York. Instead, the judge became fixated on narrow definitions of who qualifies as a journalist and never meaningfully engaged with the evidence we submitted. Filings we made clearly showed the disadvantage we were placed under, especially since the Blake Lively-Justin Baldoni case was sealed and inaccessible to us. We even formally requested access through the Florida docket so we could defend ourselves fairly, and those requests were ignored entirely. From my perspective, this was an egregious error that runs directly counter to the First Amendment. This issue is bigger than me, which is why I'm grateful to be here talking about it. I'm trying to make this as loud as possible because I don't want this decision to become a weapon against independent and digital journalists in Florida or elsewhere. Everything I provided was legitimate news gathering. It proved there was no retaliation, no payments, no coordination. I even offered a full financial audit. I had already been audited earlier in the year and offered to submit everything again, including a third-party accountant who could verify we were never paid by Wayfarer. That offer was ignored. The judge ignored it. Blake Lively's attorney ignored it. That's not how justice is supposed to work. We are appealing. A notice of appeal is being filed, if it hasn't already gone through, and we'll take this to the 11th Circuit. If necessary, I'll go all the way to the Supreme Court. What happened here is completely unjust, and the implications are genuinely frightening. This all traces back to the summer, when Blake subpoenaed Google seeking information on roughly 16 content creators, including financial and personal data. Many of us were targeted through Google, and it raised serious alarm. Creators pushed back, challenged the subpoenas, and when they did, Blake dropped them. Anyone who fought it was eventually let go. I even had my lawyer call Blake's legal team on a recorded line to confirm whether the Google subpoena was legitimate or spam. The response was evasive and uncomfortable, and when I published the call, her legal team falsely accused me of illegally recording it, despite the recording clearly stating it was being recorded. What became clear is that Blake didn't want resistance on the federal docket. When people pushed back, especially when organizations like the ACLU got involved, those subpoenas were quietly dropped. Perez Hilton experienced the same thing. Once the ACLU entered the picture in Nevada, Blake backed off. That tells you a lot. So why am I still standing alone? Because my fight is happening in Florida. I couldn't access sealed filings from the New York case, which put me at a major disadvantage. And they knew that. They used that imbalance strategically, and the court misunderstood it entirely. At the heart of this case is a dangerous question. Who gets to be called a journalist? Florida's statute defines a professional journalist as someone who regularly gathers, records, writes, edits, or publishes news for livelihood. That describes me and countless digital journalists. But the statute then lists traditional media entities, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, and that's where courts get stuck. YouTube isn't viewed as a network, even though functionally it is. That outdated interpretation is what makes this ruling so dangerous. Journalism has evolved. Digital platforms are networks. Online publications are news outlets. If former TV journalists move online, they don't suddenly lose their constitutional protections. That idea is absurd, and yet that's exactly what this ruling implies. Blake Lively remains convinced that Justin Baldoni's team paid content creators to smear her. That accusation is completely untrue. I submitted sworn affidavits stating I never received a single dollar from Baldoni or anyone connected to him. I invited full financial scrutiny. Why would I do that if I had something to hide? If my communications are eventually produced, I have nothing to be ashamed of. What Blake's team ultimately wanted was my sources. They told my lawyers that if I gave up a source, they'd let it go. I refused. Giving up a source would destroy my credibility and undermine journalism itself. That's where I drew the line. And that's why I fought back out as a journalist. If I were to give up my source, that would completely destroy my credibility and make it impossible to get future sources to trust me. Would anyone feel safe coming to me if I were willing to hand them over the moment pressure was applied? It felt intentional, like they were trying to discredit and dismantle me because I've been openly critical of them. The truth is, there's no clear, universally accepted definition of what makes someone a journalist anymore. I spent years working at NBC News and never once carried a card or badge declaring me an official journalist. I did apply for a press pass in Burbank to cross police lines during emergencies, and that helped, but does that suddenly make someone more legitimate? What we're doing now is fundamentally the same work, just on different platforms. Journalism didn't stop being journalism because it moved online. This case could very well end up at the Supreme Court, not because anyone wants it to, but because it may be necessary to finally answer the question of who qualifies as a journalist in the modern era. That question matters, because what's happening here sets a dangerous precedent. A celebrity who dislikes coverage can file a lawsuit and then use that lawsuit as justification to demand a journalist's private communications. By simply alleging harassment, they gain a legal weapon to pry into reporting practices. Even without clearly demonstrating what the alleged harassment actually was, the ramifications are chilling. If this stands, celebrities with enough money and legal firepower could systematically target anyone who reports critically on them. They could demand communications from reporters, commentators, and creators across platforms, creating a climate where people no longer feel safe to investigate or speak freely. That's not accountability, that's intimidation. What makes this especially troubling is the irony. Blake Lively claims abuse of power by others, yet multiple legal experts have pointed out that she held control throughout the entire process. She consistently got what she wanted, while Justin Baldoni absorbed the damage. Now, any attempt by him to defend himself is framed as retaliation. Experiencing this firsthand, it's hard not to see it as deeply punitive and personal. What's also unfair is that the actual defendants in the case have their communications protected, while mine, as a third party, do not. It feels like a backdoor way to access information that otherwise can't be reached. As a non-party journalist, I should have been the last stop for discovery, not the first. Courts are supposed to require exhaustion of other sources before coming after a journalist, and that didn't happen here. The judge appeared to misunderstand the scale and complexity of the case, how many journalists were involved, and the difference between routine news gathering and anything resembling defamation or retaliation. That misunderstanding led to a serious disservice, including mischaracterizing my privilege log. Creating that log was exhaustive and costly. I reviewed every communication mentioning names tied to the case. Even though those names appear constantly in normal newsroom discussions, I did the work carefully and in good faith, provided far more transparency than required, and even submitted materials for in-camera review. There was nothing improper in them. Despite that, formatting technicalities became the focus instead of substance. Offers to involve third-party auditors and accountants, independent professionals who could verify everything, were ignored. The emphasis was never on truth, only on pressure. That's what makes this feel punitive rather than procedural. At the core of all of this is a refusal to accept that criticism can be organic. The idea that people would independently question behavior, investigate inconsistencies, or report uncomfortable facts seems incomprehensible to those used to being universally praised. But that instinct to examine power is exactly what journalism is supposed to do. I reached out to both sides for comment, as journalists are supposed to. No one from Baldoni's team initiated contact with me. I initiated outreach to everyone involved, including Blake's representatives, and documented it. That's standard practice, not retaliation. Hollywood often struggles with accountability because power and money insulate people from consequences. When success becomes the only moral compass, criticism feels like betrayal rather than scrutiny. And when that mindset collides with the legal system, the danger isn't just to one reporter, it's to the press as a whole. The most unsettling part is how uneven the protections are. Large corporate outlets have legal shields and institutional backing. Independent journalists don't. When the law fails to recognize modern journalism, it leaves those working outside traditional newsrooms exposed and vulnerable. And that imbalance should concern anyone who cares about free expression. A question came in from the chat about Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively, and whether this controversy could permanently damage their careers. A lot of people were saying they couldn't wait for everything to come out because, in their view, Ryan and Blake would never recover and would never work in Hollywood again. That raised the question of whether that was actually realistic. The response was pretty clear that Ryan Reynolds is not going anywhere. As long as audiences are interested in Deadpool, he'll continue working. Deadpool remains a powerful and profitable franchise, and beyond that, Ryan has made an enormous amount of money outside of acting. He's deeply invested in businesses and has diversified his career so well that he doesn't actually need Hollywood in the traditional sense anymore. Even if he chose to step back, he'd still be financially secure and influential. As for Blake Lively, the situation feels less certain. She has a strong relationship with Lionsgate, especially through projects like A Simple Favor and its sequel. One executive at Lionsgate reportedly seemed largely unaware or unconcerned about the controversy, suggesting that within parts of the industry this issue may not carry the same weight as it does online. Still, it remains to be seen how things will play out for her long term. There was also chatter in the chat claiming Ryan Reynolds had lost a 3-picture deal with Paramount. While that rumor circulated, there doesn't appear to be any reputable reporting confirming that such a deal was terminated. What did happen was Paramount canceling several projects as part of internal restructuring, following mergers and leadership changes. One of those cancellations involved a Ferris Bueller spin-off produced by Reynolds, which appears to be more about the studio cleaning house and focusing on safer franchises like Transformers and Star Trek, rather than targeting Ryan specifically. His production company, Maximum Effort, still maintains a first-look deal, and he continues to have major projects in motion. There was also discussion about the financial performance of Deadpool and Wolverine. The bigger concern raised was Blake Lively's standing within the industry. The argument was that producers and studios may become hesitant to work with her due to the level of controversy and the fear of potential claims or disruptions on set. That concern seems amplified by the noticeable silence from people who once publicly supported her. Early on, many figures in Hollywood expressed support, but lately that backing appears to have faded. Meanwhile, Justin Baldoni has been seen attending public events with well-known industry figures, and there's visible support around him. In contrast, Blake doesn't appear to be receiving the same public backing, which could be a troubling sign given how quickly Hollywood allegiances shift. Another telling moment involved Brandon Signore, who recently appeared on The Today Show to promote his new film with Sydney Sweeney. When asked how he landed the role, he credited Sydney Sweeney rather than Blake Lively. Despite previous reports that Blake had helped connect him with the director, People magazine later published comments from the director confirming Blake's involvement, but Signore noticeably avoided mentioning her. This omission stood out, especially given that other interviews involving people connected to Blake have similarly avoided the subject entirely. The absence of Blake's name in these interviews, combined with careful media framing, suggests that some people may be intentionally distancing themselves from her, whether that's fear, strategy, or simply shifting power dynamics. It gives the impression that Ryan Reynolds' influence may not extend as far as it once did in protecting Blake's standing. Ultimately, the consensus was that Ryan Reynolds will be just fine. He's diversified, financially secure, and anchored by a blockbuster franchise that audiences still love. Blake Lively's future, however, appears far less predictable, especially if industry support continues to quietly evaporate while the legal and public scrutiny drags on. What really stands out to me is how telling this whole situation has become. Brandon has clearly changed his story and has effectively erased Blake from his narrative. And we're seeing something similar with Colleen Hoover. In her recent major interview, she more or less said she's done with everything and even expressed embarrassment over the book. These are two people who were once very vocal in their early support of Blake as a victim, and now they've gone completely quiet. To me, that says everything. It's hard to understand how people don't see through the facade of Blake's argument when two of the most crucial voices who once stood firmly behind her no longer do. If this had truly been a clear case of serious harassment and Justin had genuinely been as terrible on set as alleged, you'd expect those supporters to be even more outspoken now. Instead, there's silence. People magazine continues to be largely tone-deaf, doing what it always does by staying friendly toward Blake and Ryan no matter what. My read on the situation is that Blake appears to be trying to take credit for Brandon's rise, or at least wants him to remain publicly grateful to her. That way, if he's ever called to testify in a civil trial, he'd feel pressured to stay in her corner. But let's be honest, if Sydney Sweeney tells Paul Feig she thinks someone should be cast, Paul Feig is going to meet with that person regardless of who else suggests it. That's just how it works. What makes this even more interesting is that Paul Feig himself has gone on record, more than once, saying it was Blake who told him to check Brandon out. This wasn't buried in a written quote, he said it in interviews, explaining how he met Brandon, liked his energy, and moved forward. Maybe Sydney mentioned him too, and maybe multiple people later took credit, but the key point is that Brandon is now choosing to erase Blake from the story entirely. That feels deliberate. If he were to mention Blake on a show like Today, it would naturally invite follow-up questions, and those questions would inevitably lead back to the broader controversy. It's very possible his team advised him not to say her name at all, because once that door opens, there's no controlling where the conversation goes. Both the interviewer and Brandon went out of their way to avoid mentioning her, and that doesn't happen by accident. From there, the conversation shifted to Andy's legal situation and his ongoing appeal process. He explained that his community rallied around him, helping fund the initial phase through donations, and that support made it possible to keep going. He described how Popcorn Planet has grown beyond a YouTube channel into a member-driven platform that includes documentaries, exclusive content, and investigative reporting. The legal fight has taken a real toll financially and personally, but he's determined not to let it end his work or set a precedent that allows powerful celebrities to intimidate independent journalists. Andy made it clear that this isn't just about him anymore. He feels a responsibility to push this as far as necessary to defend digital journalism as a legitimate form of press. In an era where even the White House press pool includes digital reporters, it makes no sense for courts to rely on outdated definitions of journalism. He doesn't want to be the person whose case weakens free speech protections for independent media. As the interview wrapped up, there was mutual appreciation for speaking openly about a topic many others have avoided. The sentiment was clear: having honest conversations, even when uncomfortable, matters. With that, the show signed off, promising more content to come and thanking viewers for their continued support.